Okay, so I'll do a very brief introduction for Hannah. Hannah is an assistant prof at Columbia Business School in the Decisions, Risk, and Operations Division and a member of the Data Science Institute. She received her PhD in operations research from Stanford University, where she was affiliated with the Operations Research Group in MS&E and the Society and Algorithms Lab. She was also a postdoctoral associate at MIT and graduated from Panoa College with a degree in mathematics. Her research interests include data science methods tailored to social systems, such as online marketplaces, education systems, social media, and digital health platforms. In particular, she has a focus on experimentation, recommendation systems, and early warning systems. All right, go ahead, Hannah.
Thank you for the introduction. So I am talking today about operational dosage, impacts of capacity constraints. Before I get into what any of this means, I just want to jump straight into a thought exercise. So, suppose that you
also, Hannah, I'm not sure, can folks hear her? Okay, oh, okay, perfect, okay. I'm not sure if your mic is on, but.
Is it not? Let's see. It seems like it's on.
Okay, great, okay.
Yeah, if people can't hear me, just let me know. And feel free to ask questions throughout.
That's perfect, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so suppose that you're testing some sort of intervention, maybe some sort of patient outreach program, and consider this hypothetical scenario where you run 2 RCTs. And for this patient outreach program, you can think of something that can be algorithmically assisted as well. So maybe you identify who's the most at risk, and then you reach out to those people. So as is kind of standard practice, usually you run a very small pilot study, and if that seems like that's promising, then you run a larger study. Now, suppose here that in your pilot study, you have 100 participants, and you estimate this 15% improvement. That's great. This is a great looking intervention. You run a larger experiment then that has 10 times the number of participants, 1,000 participants, and here you estimate still a smaller improvement, 10%. So, question for everyone here, which of these RCTs do you think provides a better estimate for the actual treatment effect? So maybe raise your hand if you think RCT1. What about RCT2? Okay, so people generally think RCT2 provides a better estimate here. You have more people, your estimates are less noisy, this is all well and good. And I can also ask you the question of which of these RCTs has higher statistical power. You would probably also say the second one. So in general, our intuition from most experiments that we run is that these larger experiments with more participants they're strictly better. But what we end up showing in our work is that actually there's a class of interventions that we call service interventions where all of this intuition is no longer true. So your larger experiment could give you a worse estimate or a worse estimate of the treatment effect, and it can actually have lower power to actually detect your treatment effect. So I'll get into how we get to all this in a little bit, but this is joint work with my collaborators, Justin Boudelier, Jonas Jonassen, and Erez Yoeli. And this work all started while we were collaborating with this platform called Kahila. So I'll start with Kahila, but again, what we're showing here is a lot more general. With Kahila, this is a platform that was designed to support tuberculosis patients in Kenya. So with tuberculosis, there is a well-known problem here where for many of these cases, there is a treatment, and yet people don't adhere to the treatment. And the reason for that is because this treatment involves taking a pill every single day for 6 to 9 months. So this, of course, we asked you to do anything for 6 to 9 months, probably you'd have trouble adhering to. So they launched Kahila in Kenya, and this was this mobile phone application where patients every day logged if they took their medication. And if they didn't log it, then someone on the platform would reach out to them and call them. So they ran actually the hypothetical scenario that I talked about earlier, Kahila faced a very similar scenario here. So first they ran a small RCT, a small pilot study, saw a huge benefit from getting this intervention, and then after that launched this to a larger group of patients, and then saw a still positive but much smaller treatment effect size. And the question was, so this is around when I got involved, the question is what happened here? What is causing these differences in estimated treatment effects? And the literature has kind of pointed to a lot of different causes. Number one, it could just be pure randomness, pure noise. In the past, people have also thought, okay, maybe people are p-hacking, maybe there's some statistical things that people aren't doing properly. That's some of the issues. But more recently, people have pointed to heterogeneity in the populations that you're studying. And so, for example, it could be that the smaller study was only run in Nairobi. Maybe the patients here are actually different from the patients across the rest of Kenya and respond differently to the intervention. And so the second experiment actually picked up on something different. Well, at this point, when I got involved in this work, I had actually been working on A/B tests with network effects and interference for a while. And we actually realized that there's something else that could be happening here that is very, very salient that people aren't talking about as much. And that is the fact that these interventions are capacity constrained, and actually that is leading to interference or spillover effects. And so what I mean by that is, well, when I told you what happened is, when I told you about the intervention, that if you skip your verification, you're reached out to by someone from the platform, this is a little bit of a simplification, because there's not always someone on the platform who's available to call you. There's people who are servicing the phones, but they can only make so many calls a day. So really, when you stop verifying, you join a queue of people waiting to be called. And when you're at the head of the queue and there's an available provider, then they actually reach out to you and call you. And so because of this, these capacity constraints, now we actually see interference, spillover effects across subjects. Essentially, each patient's outcome now depends on how often they get service, or how frequently, how quickly they get service. But this now depends on how many other patients are also waiting for the service. So this is how we see the spillover effects. And here, what we end up showing is that when we look at these average treatment effects, well, we really have to think about a global average treatment effect that depends on both the number of providers available on the platform, as well as the number of patients on the platform. And this leads to what we call this operational dosage effect. And we call it this because it's kind of saying the more patients you have, essentially, the less often each person is getting called, the less often each person is getting treated. So it's kind of analogous to the pharmaceutical trials of how large is the dose of the pill that you're actually getting. And another reason that we call it this is to kind of highlight how important we think this should be. In drug trials, it's obvious that if you're giving someone one drug, one pill every 10 days versus every other day, this is a very different intervention. And yet for these kinds of service interventions, people don't often think about these metrics as much. For drug trials, there are mandates that you have to record how often people get the medication, what size dose they're getting, but no such mandate exists for trials of these service interventions. And so we actually looked through the literature, it's admittedly a bit of a brief look, but from a lot of the service interventions that we see, there's not a lot of people recording, exactly when people get the actual service, how long they had to wait, and these relevant metrics like that. There is some preliminary evidence, however, that this is a problem. Yeah, Chris.
Can I think about this like a sort of botched intervention in the sense that there should have had enough people to call everyone, or somehow that's not the right way to think about it, and inevitably there's going to be a capacity constraint?
So it really depends. Essentially, the issue here is that the effect of an intervention really corresponds to some sort of dosage. And then maybe, like you're saying, in some people's minds, they think as soon as this patient is eligible to be called, they should be called immediately. That could be kind of an intended dosage, but then what's actually implemented is a lower dosage. But you could also think of other settings where people don't intend immediate service, but they intend maybe some amount of wait time. But in any case, the treatment effect will depend on the wait time. So there is some preliminary evidence, empirical evidence, that this is a problem right now. So coming out of the study from Penn, they looked at a very similar patient medication adherence structure with a very similar structure as this Kahila setting. Here they gave heart attack patients these electronic pill bottles. And so these electronic pill bottles would record if the patients actually took their medication, that they opened their medication. And then if not, someone on the platform also reached out to them. They also implemented a bunch of other interventions, lottery systems, things like where they also reached out to their partners as well. And overall, it's, I think a very impressive study, and people expected this to really work. But when they actually looked at the results, they actually found that there were no significant effects, either on patient outcomes or even patient adherence levels. And so this didn't really make sense to people, and so the same authors actually went back into this data, and they saw that actually there's heterogeneity in how people responded to this treatment, and that some people responded very well to this treatment, and those were actually the patients who were called immediately after they stopped taking their medication, whereas other people who didn't get such a strong effect had to wait a much longer time to be called. And so they looked through the data and found that there were a number of reasons why people weren't called immediately, one of which is the platform having limited capacity. And I also want to point out here that I think these are kind of very difficult settings to know upfront how much capacity you need. Because these are interventions where we're saying, when the people enter some eligible state, then they should be called. But you don't know how often they'll enter this eligible state up front. And so this is kind of a harder intervention to plan for than an intervention where you say, oh, I'm going to call the patient every other week, and so I know exactly how many phone calls to plan for. Is there a question? Yes.
But there could also be, of course, confounders here, right? Like the kinds of people who would have more limited capacity, or maybe in regions that also have,
Yes.
populations that are having more trouble with their health.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a great point. So I think broader context for what we're pointing out here is that heterogeneity in the dosage, this operational dosage, is one factor that will affect heterogeneous treatment effects. But there are a number of other factors as well, such as just different patient populations that differ with respect to different scenarios. But kind of these other types of heterogeneity are pretty well documented and are now kind of well known within that area. This heterogeneity and this operational dosage is something that we're realizing is very important, that people right now aren't talking about as much. Is there another? Yeah.
Do we have a sense in a population in a setting like this, how many people are never takers and how many people are what I would describe as often enough takers? Like they're not perfect compliers, but their compliance is good enough that we don't want to waste contact resources on them? Because it seems like when you have this big pool, there's this question of how many calls any given person needs to change their compliance rate in a way that is useful.
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is kind of saying, now that we know our intervention's capacity constrained, how should we actually, tailor that? How should we target that? So there's been a lot of great work done in this area, where Jackie has actually done that work on this Kahila data set as well, this tuberculosis data set as well. Kind of the focus of this work is more, what happens when we don't realize that these capacity constraints are actually there? How does this affect our experiments? How does this affect what we actually measure? So to preview the results, and then happy to take more questions, to preview the results, what we find is that this operational dosage creates changes in the treatment effect in kind of ways that we would expect. So here, this line is showing for a given capacity level, given number of providers on the platform. If I have a small number of patients in the treatment group, they're going to have a really high treatment effect. They're going to be reached out to very often, whereas as the number of patients increase, you get a smaller treatment effect. So I think this is pretty natural, pretty intuitive. But one thing that we can actually notice here is that there is structure to how this curve behaves, in that for the small number of patients, actually, this is flat. The treatment effect is flat. You can increase the number of patients without decreasing your treatment effect. And at some point, that'll start to decrease. And that all comes from the underlying structure of this system, which is essentially a queuing system. And queuing systems, how people wait, and these are systems that people have talked about for a very long time. Operations researchers have studied this well for decades. There's a lot of structure here. And whoops. what this actually points to is that there are different regimes, this quality-driven regime, this middle regime, and this efficiency-driven regime, where the treatment effect actually behaves differently. And so, again, just want to emphasize that there's no single treatment effect of the intervention. Really, there's a treatment effect that depends on your dosage level. Kind of going back to what the organizers were saying earlier about this intervention-only analysis, if we're running an RCT, oftentimes the RCTs that people are running, they're not considering the dosage level, they're just saying what's the effect of the intervention, but they really need to be considering the dosage as well. Is there a question? Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of like projecting your research forward, but there's massive companies being built right now for AI voice agents, so it's not just going to be dosage, it's going to be like human or like 11 labs. Like I'm saying, like, health systems are paying companies to make tons of phone calls for meds, for procedures. Like, yeah, it's a mess.
I imagine that it is a mess. So I think here we're pointing out this problem, what you want to do with that problem. I think there's a million, directions from there.
Yeah, no, I'm saying it's not just like the dosage in terms of frequency and number of calls. Like the next step is going to be like, what type of phone call is it? Is it like a human calling a patient?
Oh, yes.
Or is it a voice agent calling?
Definitely.
That's what I'm saying.
So actually hold on to that question for about maybe 10, 15 minutes, because we're going to come back to that as well. Yeah.
Hi, so thanks, this is really interesting. I guess it's interesting that you say that like the treatment is a function of the dosage, how exactly are you defining the treatment? Because I could think of it as, the goal of the practitioner is to understand what is the effect of providing an intervention when the ratio of people on the platform to service providers is like some ratio P, and they want to estimate that quantity rather than the actual value of the treatment being
Right, so that's exactly what we're saying here. We're saying that the ratio of the number of providers that you have to the number of subjects that you have, that should be something that determines how large the effect is of the whole intervention. And that's something that we need to measure explicitly, whereas right now people are just saying, oh, what's the effect of giving these patients outreach? Where that patient outreach is essentially not well defined. So a couple of things to also point out here. If we ignore these capacity constraints, which they often are, this can lead to failure of experiments to replicate or perform well at scale. This has been an issue that people have brought up in the economics literature a lot. And this, again, is one more mechanism for why that might be happening. Another thing that will kind of follow from this is that later when we were thinking about how do you actually design experiments, how do you decide how many participants to recruit, if you're trying to maximize power to detect an effect, you might actually want to recruit fewer subjects rather than more. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask, is if we want to estimate the treatment effect, are we talking about only sort of that far left end, or do you want to estimate the entire curve? Because ultimately, you're going to want to scale up. So when you present results, is it going to be to say to estimate the whole curve, it's best to be in the middle, or is it just estimate that left tail?
So this is a really good point. I would say that this is kind of the first work, our first work on this project. This is kind of pointing out that this is a problem and that there is this curve. But what you want to do with that, I think, can really depend. So one thing that we point out is that actually you might have different estimands here as well. Like your estimand might be what is a treatment effect if you had infinite capacity, which, like you said, or it could be when we're actually scaling up, we know that we only want to service 150 people. So this is the thing that we're estimating. So that's exactly one thing that we're pointing out. I will say one thing that we're able to say here is I think the way you should approach this problem should depend on the type of RCT that you're running. So are you running a sort of efficacy trial where you're trying to show that in optimistic scenarios there's an effect, or are you trying to say run an effectiveness trial where you're trying to look at the effect in realistic scenarios? So that, how you manage your capacity should depend on what is your actual objective there. Yeah, great question. Yes?
Sorry, quick question. So if you keep N1 on the x-axis, but you scale M1 proportionally to N1, what would this curve look like?
I will show you in about 2 slides. Yes. And one last thing I want to point out here before I actually jump into how we do this analysis. Again, this is a very structured curve to this. And this, I think, is part of where operations can add a lot to this field, to causal inference. How people usually think about these like estimation problems and causal inference, you want to make as few assumptions as possible. Because oftentimes if you make an assumption, your data is not going to fit that assumption, and then you just get wrong estimates. But in settings like this, in some settings, we actually do have a lot of structure behind the problem. We know how people interact with the system, or rather how the system interacts with them. We do have data on when they're actually reached out to, and kind of when we do have the structure, we can get better estimates by leveraging that. And we can use these tools from operations research, these math modeling, stochastic process tools, to actually incorporate that structure. And so that's exactly what we end up doing. We model the system using stochastic models. We have this continuous time markup chain model of different patients, where patients, patients in treatment and control. Patients can go back and forth between this good state and a bad state. You can also think of this as a state that's eligible for the intervention or not eligible. And control patients who don't have access to the platform will just go back and forth based on their own transitions. And people in the treatment group will have access to this platform. And so what happens is when they go from the good state to the bad state, now they actually enter the queue of people waiting to be called. And when they're at the head of the queue, they're serviced and they're called. And so there's some rate at which calls are happening. There's some probability that each call is actually effective because you're not forcing the patient to do anything. And patients who are waiting to be called can transition back to the good state themselves of their own accord, just like the control patients can transition back to the good state. Okay. And so this is our model of the underlying system behavior. And we're going to use this to say, okay, if our system actually does follow a model like this, what would we end up measuring in an RCT? We're not actually going to be estimating any of these quantities. We're just going to use this as a data generating process. And what we want to measure here, the thing that we're interested in, is the proportion of time that people spend in the good state. So this is the metric of interest. We call this the steady state adherence level, and then we do a bunch of math to quantify that. I'm not going to go too much into this. But and the difference, and then we consider a difference in means estimator that just compares the proportion of time that people spend in the good state in the treatment group minus the control group. Now, the one important thing from this slide is that there are different treatment effects that depend on the number of people in your control group and the number of providers there. And so this is what I meant earlier when I said the treatment effect of the intervention is not well defined. Now it very much is, it's clear that it depends on these two factors. And we can also prove some nice CLTs about this difference in means estimators. We can show that it's consistent to some quantities. Maybe I'll get back to that a little bit later. But yeah, we have, there's some nice things that we can say about this. Yeah.
Does the data generation process ever allow for it being positive effects, like for positive spillovers, or is it assumed explicitly that it will be going down in the treatment effect?
Oh, yeah. So this is a good point. I think there are different kinds of spillovers here, and essentially what this model is doing is it's focusing on a very specific kind of spillover. And this is a spillover that arises only through interactions with the system. So maybe to contrast with this, oftentimes when we think of spillovers, we think of some sort of underlying social network, where if you tell one person to take their medication, maybe they take their medication, their friend sees them taking their medication, and now their friend is more likely to take their medication as well. So that happens through interactions with each other, and this type of interaction, we're saying, even if people don't interact with each other at all outside of the platform, the spillovers are happening because of interactions with the platform. And so this will strictly be a negative type of spillover.
In that case, yeah, sorry. If I teach 30 students, the 31st, I have a really good explanation. If I only do 2, it might be bad. So sorry, I used the wrong word, but I mean, could it ever be positive as you continue to increase the size of this?
Like with text, if you get a few texts, the treatment effect's positive, and then it starts becoming negative because I just don't want to hear from the health system anymore.
I see. So right now we don't consider that. What that would mean is, for example, for text becoming less effective over time, then maybe this P, the probability that the call is effective, is now changing as a function of your history. So we don't consider that here, but that's very much something that we could consider. And then I think what you're suggesting is that the rate at which calls are happening, or the Ps, this could also depend on how many people are waiting in the queue. This isn't something we consider right now, but this could be very much well be something we could consider in the future. Yeah.
Wouldn't the delay in the queue capture a lot of this, that the parameters are, the number of people, the number of providers, number of treatment? Isn't the average delay in the queue the thing that the patient actually experiences? Wouldn't that capture most of the effects of all the parameters?
So the delay in the queue captures a lot of this, but kind of the suggestions that we were hearing are actually saying, even conditional on delays in the queue, how these sponsors, how these providers treat these patients might also change. So there could be time-changing, time-varying parameters as well. So kind of there's a lot of different things, but here we focus on just delays in the queue. All right, so let me maybe start to go through some of the implications, and then there's some questions, I'll come back. So skipping some of this math, what are the main implications of this? Well, number one is that the more patients you have for a fixed capacity, the smaller the effect size is. And this is coming through changes in the queue length, so the delays in the queues. And again, we see here that there's these two very distinct regimes. This left regime where the queue length doesn't really grow, and also your treatment effect is relatively fixed. And then a point after that where actually your treatment effects are really decreasing very quickly. So this is the main thing. Also, another very intuitive thing that we can show is that if we increase the number of subjects, treatment effect decreases. If we increase the number of providers, now the treatment effect will increase because they're, again, getting service more often. And we can prove both of these two things. We prove both of these two statements using what's called this large-scale fluid limit, where this is essentially looking at kind of the law of large numbers, but applied to these Markov chains. And if we do that, skipping through some of the details, we can see that there's two distinct regimes for what the average treatment effect is, one of which does not depend on the server to patient ratio, and another one that does. Happy to talk about this more after as well. How much time do I have?
-5 minutes.
-5 minutes, okay.
No, actually, you're right on time. Are you close to the end, or?
No. So let me see if there's
Maybe like a couple more minutes before.
Okay, cool. So I will. Sounds good. So there have been a lot of great questions, which I love. So this is essentially what we're saying. So these capacity constraints are a problem. And there's a lot of things that we can do about this. We can actually use the underlying queuing structure to actually do better designs, to actually get better power here. But I want to, before I stop, tie this back to what we were talking about earlier, which is these ML-assisted decision-making. And what I've talked about so far is that capacity constraints are a huge issue. But oftentimes, we kind of have capacity constraints that aren't as salient, that are a little bit hidden. And these are settings like these AI-assisted decision-making settings, where in education, maybe you have early warning systems that'll predict who the at-risk students are, and then advisors are supposed to reach out to them. Or in healthcare, we talked about the sepsis early warning systems. You predict the at-risk patients. Rapid response teams will then reach out to these people. You can also think about platform AI screening tools as well. So you flag who you think the promising candidates are, and then recruiters will then act on those. These are all capacity-constrained interventions in the exact same way. So here, the algorithm is not capacity-constrained, but what actually is capacity-constrained is the delivery of these actual interventions through people, through capacity-constrained resources. And so all of these will actually face the same issues that we talked about up until now. And I will briefly highlight one question that we looked at with my collaborator Lydia and Princeton PhD student Kara Sheckman over there. We think about, okay, in these kind of AI human settings, how critical is the human component? What if instead we have automated calls instead, going back to our question earlier? And so we actually do this kind of auditing work that studies how much are the humans adding versus how much of the benefit could just be from predictive systems alone. And what we end up finding is that humans actually are very crucial here, at least in this Georgia State education experiment that we focus on. So I know that we are out of time. I will wrap up. Capacity constraints are very important. They create this operational dosage effect. It shows up in a lot of interventions, even AI-enabled interventions. And through these interventions, we can kind of disentangle the contributions of humans versus algorithms as well when we're thinking about how to scale. So, thank you.
Yeah, so we have, we can probably take like one question, maybe two, before the break. You guys were so active when she was presenting. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like the capacity itself is part of the potential intervention. And in the data, do you just observe the capacity just changes over time, or you actually intervene in the experiment, or how does that?
Yeah, so this experiment was, run as just like a kind of simple intervention. So in this intervention, we do see the data for like when people were called, when they were eligible to be called, and we do see evidence of long wait times for people waiting to be called. So we do see that. And sorry, what was this?
But it's not part of the intervention, right?
Right, that's not part of the
intervention. Like how many people working at the call center, or like there's a lot of factors that affects the capacity itself.
Exactly. So that's not part of the intervention.
But you assume sort of that's exogenous, or?
So I'm not sure what you mean by that. So what we're saying here is that this intervention really causes differences in treatment effects. What causes the changes in, the capacity causes the changes in treatment effects. What causes the capacity, there could be a number of reasons. Maybe someone just didn't show up to work that day. Maybe there are other people. So, but oftentimes when people think about this, they just say like, what is the treatment effect of the intervention, which is what we're saying is problematic.
Right, but if the policymakers want to intervene, they may or may, increase capacity in a certain way.
Yes.
And it seems like in order to learn what would happen and then that intervention, you need to have some data, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, you extrapolate just.
Yes. Great point. So actually what we end up doing that I didn't have time to go into is we actually do use that data, and we use that to fit a model of human behavior, of like patient behavior, and then we use that model to extrapolate what happens if we have 10 calls per day versus 100 calls per day. And those are the relevant quantities you would want as a policymaker. So these capacity-dependent treatment effects, and those should be what's going into your cost-benefit analysis that you're doing. Yeah, great point.
Yeah, I have a related question. Sorry, I know I shouldn't be speaking, but I was going to say the availability of the intervention seems to be what's affected by the capacity constraint. But I think there's another way you could frame it where it's like, the length of the call, for example, is variable, or and that maybe is a more direct analogy to dosage. Did you guys consider those other ways in which the experience of independent of the availability of the outreach worker, just are they all using the exact same script? Is the length of the calls unanimous? Are there other things that you could consider as part of this dosage, the definition of dosage here when it comes to the intervention? Because it's so, to the point, underdefined. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this this is a huge problem. Everything's underdefined. So in the phone calls that we see, we do have the length of the phone calls. Some of them are a couple of minutes, and some of them are an hour, and we don't know what they're talking about during those phone calls.
Okay.
So that is again another way that these things are,
Yeah.
underdefined. And I think what this is really pointing to is that when we're looking at these human-delivered interventions, we really can't be talking about these human-delivered interventions as a single intervention because you have these dosage things, the length, what they're actually talking about.
Yeah.
There's just a lot more that we have to do there, which is it's part of like bridging the algorithms and the actual intervention. Yeah.
Great tie into the title of the workshop. Excellent. Okay, so we have 15 minutes up for a break, and then please be back here by, what are we? 11. Okay. Yeah, there's coffee, there's snacks outside. Please help yourself. Thanks so much, Hannah.